Hey everyone, welcome to a great episode of Tech Corner. James Azar here, your host. I hope you're ready because I've got Perry Carpenter joining me here in just a moment from Know Before. We're going to be talking about a wide array of things that are going on in cybersecurity, from the psychology of social engineering and deception to situational awareness and the measuring of behaviors. So it's going to be an awesome episode. And if you don't know Perry, Perry also hosts a podcast, which is absolutely magnificent. He's one of the thought leaders in our industry, and I'm very excited to have him on the show. But before I do that, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast. Go check out our CISO Talk podcast. We just published an episode yesterday for you, so go check that out. Those are 45-minute conversations with chief information security officers, no sales, just straight talk, just like Tech Corner. So without further ado, let's get the show on the road.
From the CyberHub bunker and studio, you're tuning in to the CyberHub podcast, Tech Corner. And now, join me in welcoming your host and CISO, James Azar.
Perry, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I got to ask you a question. How weird is it to be a guest on a podcast and not kind of running your own?
It's not actually too weird, right? Because I think that a lot of us enjoy conversations, and so we try to make the rounds on other great podcasts. And my podcast is quite a bit different than most that are out there too. So it's I just enjoy it. I enjoy it. So thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure having you here. So folks who don't know who Perry is the Chief Evangelist and Strategy Officer over at our friends at Know Before. But he's also been a board member on the National Cybersecurity Alliance. He's an official member and contributor over at the Forbes Business Council. He's a founder of the Awareness Incubator. He stays very, 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 very busy. And so in his past, you've also been at Gartner and Fidelity National Information Services. So Perry, you've got quite a storied career to where you've gotten today.
I appreciate it. Yeah. I mean, it's been a journey. So, for those of you that are just starting your cybersecurity careers, I didn't even start out in cybersecurity. I got a bachelor's in biblical studies and a bachelor's in philosophy, and had minors in Greek and Hebrew, and then didn't know what to do with my life after that. So I started to go to law school and realized that I wasn't cut out for law, and so went into computers and kind of ended up being drafted into security over a series of fun events, and then focused on the human side, because what I started to realize is we were doing lots of great things on the tech side, but people kept bypassing the technology over and over and over and exploiting the human. So the psychology piece of this became more and more fascinating, especially over the past 15 years.
Yeah, I love that. So do you still remember any of the Hebrew you studied?
So I spent a summer in Israel as part of that, and learned a little bit of conversational Hebrew, but most of my training in Hebrew was, of course, very old form. So it was really interesting to see the biblical Hebrew translated into the modern language.
Right.
Which is really fun to see on billboards and like exterminator trucks and things like that. These terms that were used in the Old Testament to mean or the Torah, depending on your worldview, to mean very specific things, then taken and generalized into the way that modern culture uses them.
Yeah, I speak fluent Hebrew, and both of my parents are Israeli. So to me, whenever I hear someone studied Hebrew, I go, "What do you think of that?" Because it's really opposite of how our brain functions in English.
Yeah, I loved it. It's a very creative language, and of course the grammatical order is different. It's very pictorial in the way that it approaches language, and the structure of everything is beautiful.
It is. So Perry, let's start to talk a little bit about psychology of social engineering, right? Because there is a psychology behind targeting someone in a social engineering campaign. We often see that with the way that they rush you, right? So the IRS phone scams, right? The cops are going to come and arrest you if you don't go get us iTunes gift cards. And people go, no one stops to think the IRS wants to get paid in iTunes gift cards. Like,
Yeah, exactly. The thing that's happening there is, I mean, the attackers are, so there's two things going on right now. There's the economic incentive that the attackers have, and then there's the psychological reality of the victim or the target. Um, the economic piece that the attacker wants is whatever they can cash out the easiest. So that's what's kind of pushing that gift card model. But the psychological reality of the target is that we don't critically think through things like that, or the common person doesn't critically think through things like that, because we can be put into this mindset that Daniel Kahneman, which is a kind of the father of behavioral economics, calls system one. And system one is very fast thinking. It's very heuristic thinking. It takes logical shortcuts, and it's really emotion driven. But it can lead to some very devastating results in some edge cases, and they're pushing us to these edge cases. System two is about 5% of our thinking. It's very logical, very methodical, very reliable. But our minds like to be a little bit lazy. They push into system one anytime they get a chance.
yeah, it's we know the threat actors target humans because we know that humans, I don't want to say humans are the weakest link, because I think that kind of defeats the point of humanity, right? If we say humans are the weakest link, then the solution to that, we'll always think of how do you eliminate the weakest link, right? So we don't want to eliminate humans per se. But threat actors are constantly going after humans. And I think part of that is the challenge we have between culture versus awareness, right? And people sometimes don't know how to separate the two. How would you define the difference between, let's say, just a typical awareness thing to culture in your world?
Well, let me back up and reframe a little bit. So I guess it's about 10 years ago at this point, I was at Fidelity Information Services, which you mentioned before. I created, and this was post breach. So Fidelity had a pretty major breach in 2011. I was part of the team that came in to restructure security after that. A good friend and CISO, mentor of mine, came in and took the CISO spot, and then brought in, like they do, people that they already know, trust, and work with to form the nucleus of a team that's going to restructure everything. So I was brought in as part of that. And I was working with the auditors and the regulators and their clients and all that. And I created a presentation called Move from Security Awareness to Security Culture Management. So this was a decade ago, before people were using the term culture with this. But the recognition there was, now I'll back up and speaks to some principles that I spill out pretty well in my book, that what we're dealing with when it comes to awareness in the human side is what I call a knowledge intention behavior gap. And so security awareness is all about information dissemination. It's if I put a video in front of me, or in front of somebody, or if I put a newsletter in front of somebody, or a sign in front of somebody, then I'll naturally assume that they'll take that in and then they'll behave in a certain way as a result. But humans aren't that simple, right? We don't just take information in and then change our behavior. And even if we believe that that information is important, and we want to change our behavior, we don't naturally do it. So there's a gap between knowing something and intending to act on it. And even when we intend to act on something, we don't naturally do it, which is why we continually fail at New Year's resolutions. We want to eat better, we want to lose weight, we want to travel more, or spend more time with family, save more money. We know all the great things that come with that, yet we fail in the action part of it. So out of that reality, out of that knowledge, intention, behavior gap, come what I call three realities of security awareness. And number one is, just because I'm aware doesn't mean that I care. Number two is, if we try to work against human nature, we will fail. And number three is, what our employees do is way more important than what they know, because it's action in the moment that determines whether we have a breach or not. And so all of that starts to become part of this larger culture conversation, because when you think about culture, it is really the codification of behaviors, beliefs, and values, and common knowledge and social pressures, all within the larger fabric of an organizational culture. And so all of that comes through modeling, through the establishment of social norms, the establishment of social pressures, common body of knowledge that continues to get reflected throughout an organization, the modeling of behaviors, and so on.
Yeah, so that kind of brings what I like to call a very interesting conversation, and I think one of the biggest challenges for practitioners. I call it the compliance-based awareness, right? The compliance-based awareness is you should care about this because if we're not, we're all going to get fined. And I'm trying to remember the last time an employee said, I'm not going to click this phishing email because of compliance.
Yeah, compliance is the lowest level of any kind of awareness, right?
Right.
So I break awareness up into a few different levels of maturation. Um, Level 0 would be there's nothing. It's undefined. People just try to, we have smart, well-intentioned people. They just try to do the right thing. But there's no program. There's no understanding of what good looks like, no driver. The lowest level driver is compliance because there's a bar that's been set. It's usually some kind of yearly information dissemination based campaign around certain things that are required by regulation or best practice. So that's the lowest level, and that's really just a check the box mindset. You go above that, you get to standard security awareness, which is the basic information dissemination with a lot of goodwill and good intent behind that. People believing that information will change behavior. You move past that and you get to behavior shaping, and you move past that and you get to culture shaping.
Yeah, that's kind of like the movement of all of that. So talk about let's talk a little bit about the shape of behavior and awareness. How do we start to kind of fix habits? Because I think habits is a little bit of awareness, but it's a lot of culture, right? Because the way people pay attention to stuff is when culturally it's embedded in their DNA. How do we embed that into the DNA almost?
Yeah. So if we take those two concepts, we'll talk about them together and then we'll pull them apart a little bit. So behavior, and I'm going to go with the BJ Fogg model for behavior. Behavior happens when three things come together at the same time. There is sufficient motivation to do the behavior is easy enough, and there's some kind of in the moment prompt to do it. So you have to have enough motivation. It has to feel easy enough in the moment, and something has to be saying you need to do this now. So when you think about that from a habit perspective, the habit could just be this internal drive, which is the prompt. And I've got the motivation, and this thing feels pretty easy. And if I were to give a quick example of that, I mean, we tend to think about phishing all the time, but let's talk password hygiene for a minute. From a password hygiene perspective, behavior would be I am motivated enough to try to create a good, unique password that is not shared across different accounts or different scenarios, and matches all the corporate policies and best practices. So motivation has to be intrinsic at that point, or there has to be some other factor that's there. At the same time, it has to be easy enough for me to create and remember that, and somebody has to be asking me to do it. So the natural prompts are always, you've received a system notification, your password is expired, or something else. But from a human capabilities perspective, each of us probably manage upwards of 200 accounts. And there is not the human capability, I think, regardless of our motivation. We can have all the great motivation in the world, and we can have all the prompting to do the right thing in the world. But virtually no one on the planet can create and remember 200 great passwords across all these different systems without some kind of algorithm in their mind, or without some kind of other compromise that would ultimately be able to be detected by a system at some point. And so at that point, if you're going to principle 2 of my 3 realities of security awareness is, we need to work with rather than against human nature. At that point, we need to recognize that nobody can do all that. It's way too hard to do that cleanly. And so you need to bring in a piece of technology like a password manager in order to do it. when we get to the larger culture conversation, then what we get is that you can have habits and you can have values, you can have catchphrases and all of that start to get social pressure and social reinforcement. Because at the end of the day, most of us are more influenced by the behavior patterns that we see people exhibiting around us than the things that we're reading. And so we will naturally, as social creatures, we will naturally start to reflect the behaviors and the values and the beliefs and the speech patterns and everything else of the peer group that we have, which explains a lot of our online behavior now, and the way that online environments are continuing to pull people into different silos that then become echo chambers, where everybody in that echo chamber is only seeing and hearing the same things, and they're naturally starting to reinforce each other's beliefs and values and patterns in that way.
Yeah, that's so, when you look at the fog behavior model, it's kind of, and you broke it down right now into those like 7 different dimensions. One of the things I always try to kind of take from that is, how do you really operationalize that within your organization as a practitioner? When you look at this behavior model, to go, how do I build a multi-level plan, and then how do I really effectively communicate it, right? Because there's an aspect of, people are expecting you, and it's almost like the executive leadership and the board, they're always expecting CISOs or security leaders to do X, Y, and Z. When you look at it from that perspective, how do you really, what would be your best practice for a practitioner on it?
Yeah, so a couple of things there. So you mentioned the 7 dimensions. That's actually the 7 dimensions of security culture, which is a framework that we have for measuring culture. And it goes through behaviors and social norms and knowledge and things like compliance and so on. So the way that we measure behavior internally at KnowBe4 is through a methodology that Kai Rohr and his team developed through really a long period of trial and error and scientific research. And we acquired Kai's company back about 2.5 years ago. And so that's where that 7 dimensions come. The fog behavior model is subtly different than that, where it's really just targeting the human behavior piece. But your point on being able to operationalize either of those is really important, because those are abstract theoretical concepts, right?
Right.
It's fun for us to read those things and talk about those things and geek out on them because it makes us feel smart. There's a difference in feeling smart by understanding a model and having operational excellence in the way that you approach your job as a CISO. And so I take that point well. The way that you operationalize that is, first of all, you use a model like that, realizing that a model is both good and bad, right? Every model is useful for a purpose, and every model has an inherent flaw built into it. So at all times, you're playing the pros and cons versus the usefulness and the flaw. Both of these models, I think, are way more useful than flawed, because they give us a great framework to work with and think about. And the biggest usefulness that each one of those gives us the ability to do is to measure and to brainstorm. So with the fog behavior model, we can actually start to design behaviors, understanding the human reality behind that. With the 7 dimensions of security culture, we're able to measure across those different 7 dimensions the relative maturity of our organization across each of those on a scale of one of well, we'll just say on whatever scale you want to. So because that's a little bit fungible. So we can start to measure that very precisely, and ultimately what we're going to get to is that once we measure something, then we can start to build an action plan. And so let's say on the 7 dimensions of culture, we saw that one of the areas that our people aren't hitting our personal expectations is on social norms. But on knowledge, they're doing fine. Well, that means, again, there's a gap between what people know and the things that they're expressing in their day-to-day reality. So then we can start to build, how do we actually start to close that gap? Well, at that point, then you start to think about, how do we change behavior? That's where the fog behavior model comes in, or some very practical things. You don't even have to be a behavior scientist. You should say, well, now we need to put a security champions program in place, because I want to seed the organization with people who are going to reflect my values, and the things that I want done, and are going to be an open, receptive person to have good security conversations, and are going to be intentional influencers throughout the organization. So that's how you operationalize. You measure, you understand the model, you start to see where the gaps are, and then you start to make inferences about how to close those gaps and test. Do A/B testing, do trials, um, be willing to try something and then try again. But ultimately, being willing to try is the biggest part.
Well, we practice cyber, right? I know people say I work in security. I say I practice cybersecurity because, it's kind of like medicine. It's constantly evolving. It's constantly changing. The playing field is never the same. No two patients are identical, right? No two diseases are identical, and the same disease could behave differently in two humans, and it could be the same exact disease, right? We see that now with COVID, that it has a specific kind of a kill chain, right? But that kill chain operates differently based on the human who gets it. And we see that if you're, 65, COVID has a higher mortality rate than if you're 25. And I like to compare medicine to security because the same is true. If I'm a small startup or a small company with very little security protocols, ransomware attack is going to move much quicker and much more rampant in my system than it would be, let's say, in a mid-sized organization that has some level of security maturity and is able to put in the right defenses in order to block it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Sorry.
No, please, Perry. The show's about you, man. I'm just
No, I mean, so the thing that I think within that is really that, I mean, you talking about the variations between organizations is really significant, right? Because that means that every organization has a specific culture that they're managing to, that's been pre-established by their founders or by their history or by the customer base that they're trying to serve or the industry that they're in. There's lots of things that start to shape the individual nature of each company. And that individual nature of the company starts to reflect their hiring practices, starts to reflect the way that they build or adhere to policies and all of that. So as a CISO, you have to be tuned into what the organization believes is important, and you have to manage to the social framework that you're working in. And then if there's a big disjoint between what you know is the right thing to do versus what the organization is ready to take on, well, then you have to figure out, how do I close that gap? And we always talk about people, process, and technology. You can move across those things and say, all right, well, right now I can't get my executive team to buy into, let's say, doing very large scale continual in your face security awareness training with high degrees of messaging. I can't get the organization to buy into that because they for whatever reason won't. Well, then at that point you say, okay, I can back off some of this messaging piece, and I can start to think about, how do I better protect the organization through an additional layer of technology or an additional layer of process or so on. So you're always pivoting around saying, what is the best adaptation that I can do to reduce risk in my organization given my current reality? And then how do I prepare for the future that I want to get to? Because that may mean you're making compromises because you're putting in processes that feel a little bit clunkier, or you're having to ask for more technology than is needed, or you're having to be disjointed in the way that you implement your technology. but that gives you the year, the year gap that you need in order to have some very specific conversations at the executive level that might be able to help transform the culture piece of this.
That's such a great point. I love when I put myself on mute and then I don't remember.
I do that all the time.
Let's talk a little bit about situational awareness and security, right? There's an aspect in security that I think a lot of us are oftentimes oblivious to, right? Some call it alert fatigue. Alert fatigue reduces situational awareness. It's kind of like getting multiple notifications on your phone. When you first get your phone, you download an app, you get a bunch of notifications. After a while, you don't pay attention to those notifications anymore. After a while, you turn off all notifications because you don't want to see them.
Absolutely.
What is your take on situational awareness in cyber?
Yeah, well, I'll throw out one more phrase. So I talked about the fog model before with this motivation, ability, and prompt. What you're talking about in the behavior science world is called prompt fatigue, right? Because notifications, the goal of a notification or the goal of an alert is to prompt you to take some kind of action.
Correct.
So you get a Facebook notification, it is prompting you to open Facebook and look at something. And so they're actually accomplishing several things at the same time in the way that they do app notifications. Is they're giving you the prompt. They're if you have enough motivation, you'll go ahead and click on that. And usually they're trying to inject some bit of curiosity or urgency or something else to increase that motivation temporarily. And they're making it as easy to do as possible because you can just click on it and you can get in. So you're not having to open up a browser and type in a website or something else. So that's what I would call a power prompt in that nature. But we do get prompt fatigue. We get so inundated with noise in our environment that we do get to the point where it's just like, let's turn off all notifications, or let's continue to bat them away without even reading them. It's just becomes reflex to push it away. Situational awareness then means that we have to understand how to capture and leverage attention to the best degree that we can based on the current risk that's being elevated, that's seeking attention. And so that means if we're taking a human-based approach with this, either we condition people to just react to the certain type of threat, which you talked about the thing that's going to stop that from being effective, or could stop that from being effective, or we have to continue to shift the way that the alert is given. There's two things that can come into this. There was an experiment done. Man, I wish I remember who did it. But it was from an advertising company. And there's been a couple forms of this. One is, you start to go through a newspaper or magazine, everything starts to look the same as you're flipping through. All the ads start to look the same. Let's say they're all, big glossy color ads. You go through and then all of a sudden you see one in black and white. Your mind treats that a little bit different. You've done what's in hypnosis or in behavior science is called a pattern interrupt. And anytime you interrupt a normal pattern with something that's completely different, that helps somebody engage with the content differently. And so in situational awareness or something like alerting, if you can inject a difference within that, then you're going to be much more likely to actually get that person's attention. Same thing was done in an ad type of experiment where you go through it and then somebody took an ad and they printed it upside down, and all of a sudden they got more people to look at that. So when we're thinking about things like, let's say banners in email that say external sender or watch out for this attachment, ultimately we're going to get to where we're blind to those. But maybe if you start shifting the color, once a quarter, once every few weeks, putting it upside down, attaching a different graphic with it or something like that, then you can start to capture attention a little bit differently. The other thing you can start to do is potentially seed things with psychological anchors, but that's a little bit of a broader, more in-depth discussion.
Yeah, you're kind of bringing up something I like to call the kind of how do you get security people to even have the same situational awareness and we often talk about the humans, the people who aren't security practitioners, right? And we want to raise security awareness and culture among them. We oftentimes forget about the frontline workers who they themselves need the same amount of attention as a non-practitioner would. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you do have to do the same thing with them, right? Because sometimes your frontline security people are the most blinded people towards the threats or towards the actual mission. And I don't mean that to be overly negative towards our industry, but lots of times we believe that we're special, that we have greater insight into security threats than anybody else, that stuff will never happen to us. And, having that perspective can effectively make us blind to a lot of the things that are there. The other thing is that it makes us unrelatable to the rest of our organization. And that's super dangerous because now it's an us versus them thing. And it makes it to where we really, really have a difficult time building the relationship that's needed in order for security to thrive within an organization. So I think we hit, we're blind to the threats. We believe that we're above policy sometimes. We condemn normal end users for doing behaviors that we do. And we create an us versus them mentality, and we unintentionally create a fractured relationship where people don't want to come to security to work through problems or to report issues or things like that. And the way that I would say it is that if you're a security professional and you get mad at all of these end users for clicking on links or things like that, well, then take the past month in your own life and be really honest, especially if you've been traveling or anything else like this. When was the last time that you were offered the ability to set up multi-factor and you didn't take it? Or you were asked to change a password and you were just doing it in the moment and you didn't follow the best practice because you said, I'll change it to something better later. Or you made some other kind of security compromise. We somehow feel entitled to make these little compromises because we believe that we can fix those things later. And in reality, laziness is going to take over, and we're going to leave those big holes within our own lives.
Well, it's laziness, and plus I think in security things always stack up, right? Your to-do list never gets shorter, just gets longer, and now you've got to try and prioritize it. So changing a password may seem low on your risk register because for a lot of people, you're like, well, it's going to prompt them to replace it in 60 days anyways. So what's the big deal if I use this password for the next 60
except you're
days?
going to be just as inconvenienced in 60 days, and you're going to make the same compromise, right?
Right. And so it's a matter of, what you talk about here and kind of wrapping up our interview is it's so critical for fundamentals, but it's also just as important to understand that you have to look at behavior. And that's why I'm a firm believer that the development of the office of the CISO and allowing a CISO to have someone who's a behavior scientist in his team, in his office, kind of going through user behavior analytics, going through morale, going through all these different things is going to be a critical part of how you operate and operationalize security in any organization going forward. I don't see how that's not the case in organizations of 5 to 10,000 people and even larger going forward.
Yeah, you have to have leaders that understand that they're working with human nature. If we see security as a systems-based problem, and that and those systems are technology-centric, then we're ultimately losing half of the equation, right? Because the reason that technology exists and the reason that our organizations exist is to serve people. And we have people that are interfacing with those technologies whose existence is to serve other people. And when the bad thing happens, whatever that is, it is people ultimately that are impacted, not the technology. Technology doesn't care that it had a breach. It's people on all sides of the equation that are the ones that are impacted and ultimately care about that.
Absolutely. We've had a dog bark, which essentially says, "Time to wrap up, James. I need to get a walk." And that's Perry's dog and not mine. So I keep him away as far as humanly possible when I'm trying to record, but I don't always when that. Sometimes they just curl up. Does yours do that too? They end up curling next to your feet?
Yeah, sometimes, but yeah, I think that was the "I'm very, very hungry and I need to go to the bathroom" at the same time bark.
Well, Perry, I want to thank you so much for your time on the show. This has been absolutely magnificent. Just let our audience briefly know what's the best way to follow you and connect with you, and how can they be more engaged in what you're doing?
Yeah, if you want to follow me, Perry Carpenter on LinkedIn is where I'm at most. I also post on Twitter occasionally, and you can follow me on my podcast. It's called Eighth Layer Insights. And if you're interested in the human behavior side of things from an awareness perspective, I wrote a book called Transformational Security Awareness. And then the Eighth Layer Insights podcast goes pretty deep into all things related to the human side of security and really human psychology in general.
I love it. Yeah, and the podcast is great. It really does help kind of organize your thoughts around human behavior beyond just, look, everyone clicked on our Amazon phishing email.
Exactly.
It's so funny. When by the way, just so you know, when I was a CISO, I never knew, I would do 5 tests a year where I wouldn't know what was coming from our security awareness team, so that they could phish me too.
Nice.
To see if I was just as vulnerable.
Yeah, that's great.
Right.
Yeah, we're phishing fiends at our company, so we phish everybody in the organization equally through very blind tests, and it's several per month.
Indeed. And Brian Jack, who's the CISO over at KnowBe4, will actually be featured in our October edition of CISO Talks. So go check that out. He talks a little bit about how he likes to phish his own employees at KnowBe4 all day long. So a great little piece stuff there as well. Perry Carpenter, folks, thank you so much. Thank you to KnowBe4 for their support. That's it for our Tech Corner today, folks. Whenever you're listening, whenever you're watching, have a great rest of your day. If you're watching this live, have a great weekend. Thank you so much for watching and tuning in. And I bid you all farewell. Most importantly, take some time off, relax, get off electronics a little bit, focus on the human interaction, one with another. And most importantly, stay cyber safe. Perry, thanks so much for coming through.
All right. Thanks so much for having me.
Cheers, folks.
Make sure to subscribe to our podcast and share it with your friends and colleagues. And get all the latest information at cyberhubpodcast.com.